Before we begin, viewer discretion is strongly advised. The following is for educational and entertainment purposes only. This is a verbatim federal courtroom testimony of the Sean Diddy Combs trial. As reported by Inner City Press, it hit like a thunderclap out of nowhere. Kid Rock entered the federal courtroom with no warning and no entourage, carrying a folder that would tear through the silence of the music industry like a wrecking ball. This wasn't about music. It wasn't about beef. It was about truth. With decades of secrets boiling beneath the surface, Rock walked and asked to be heard, and then dropped a set of revelations that stunned the gallery and knocked the air out of Diddy's defense. Nobody saw it coming, not the press, not the court, and definitely not Diddy. But from that moment forward, the trial would never be the same, because Kid Rock didn't come to talk. He came to expose, and what he had to say about surveillance silence and a pattern of abuse might just be the final nail in the coffin for an empire that thought it could outlast everyone. Federal courtrooms are built for formalities, slow rhythms, rehearsed movements, and tight security. But on the seventh day of the Diddy trial, something broke through the routine. It started with a simple sound, the double doors creaking open at 11:12 a.m. People turned their heads, expecting a clerk or maybe a late juror. But what they saw instead was a man in a black tailored suit, sunglasses on, holding a thick folder with a gold clip and A. Stiff spine, his walk was firm, his expression unreadable. Kid Rock. He didn't say a word. He didn't stop to check for approval. He walked straight to the front left bench of the gallery and sat down, eyes locked on the judge. Courtroom murmurs began instantly. Reporters scribbled in their notebooks. The bailiff paused mid-step. Prosecutors exchanged glances. But the most visible reaction came from Diddy himself. He looked up from a side conversation with his lawyer, eyes landing directly on Rock's lips. Titan, one juror, later described it as like watching a balloon pop in slow motion. Kid Rock had long been viewed as a cultural outsider to Diddy's polished empire. He didn't play the Hollywood game. He didn't attend those infamous after parties. And he certainly wasn't bound by the invisible rules that kept others quiet. So when he pulled out a folder, thick sealed, an official in the room snapped to full attention. The judge, visibly surprised but composed, asked if he was there in connection to the prosecution's witness list. Rock replied calmly, "I have material I've been holding on to for years. It's time someone looked at it." What followed wasn't delay, it wasn't confusion. It was a procedural halt. The judge summoned a brief sidebar, then allowed Rock's folder to be handed over to the clerk. It was placed directly on the judge's bench. For the next 12 minutes, the entire courtroom sat in eerie silence as she flipped through the contents one page at a time. When she looked up, her expression had changed. "We will admit this into evidence under corroborative material related to pattern of behavior." The courtroom exploded, not in sound, but in energy. Something had shifted. And Diddy knew it. The contents of the folder weren't what anyone expected. Not grainy photos, not anonymous allegations. They were crisp, organized, cross-referenced, court-certified metadata backed up each timeline entry. At least 5 sworn statements from former security guards, housekeepers, drivers, and personal assistants, printed emails, travel records, and incident reports from private security firms hired by Diddy's team. This wasn't gossip. It was evidence stacked, verified. Time. The first document introduced to the jury was a 2017 incident report from a Miami estate manager detailing how a female guest had tried to leave a party and was told via radio she doesn't leave until he says the guest was Cassie. Next came a screenshot of internal communications from a hotel chain that frequently hosted Diddy's events, referencing privacy restrictions for VIPs with prior incident flags. Names were redacted, but the context was clear. These weren't normal parties. The third piece was what broke the jury's composure. A sworn affidavit from a former audio tech who had worked Diddy's tour in 2016. In it, he described seeing surveillance monitors in the basement of a private compound, feeds showing multiple rooms during private experiences, all logged and time-stamped. He alleged the recordings were stored on external drives and handled exclusively by a staff member named in the document. He didn't just say what he saw. He included the model numbers of the cameras, the network storage system, and exact dates of updates to the drives. Cassie's lawyers didn't flinch. They nodded slowly, confirming that this lined up with the claims made earlier in the trial. Diddy's attorneys, on the other hand, started flipping through their binders, searching for any procedural block. But it was too late. The evidence was in. The jury was listening, and for the first time, they weren't just hearing Cassie's story. They were seeing its shadow in cold, clinical detail. Kid Rock sat still the entire time, his hands folded. He never smiled, never made a sound, just watched. After a short recess, the court reconvened. The judge leaned forward and addressed the courtroom. "Mr. Ritchie, if you are prepared to deliver a statement, the court will hear it now." Kid Rock stood. He didn't bring notes. He didn't clear his throat. He simply said, I didn't come here to make headlines, I came here because the truth's been buried under platinum plaques and billion-dollar smiles for too damn long. He went on to explain that over the years he'd received messages, emails, and even late-night phone calls from people too afraid to speak publicly. He said most of it sounded too crazy to be real until the story started repeating same words, same tone, same pain, different voices, and all pointing in the same direction. I've toured with monsters, and Saints Rock said, and I've ignored more than I should have, but when I saw that clip of Cassie looking over her shoulder before speaking in that interview, something clicked. I've seen that look fear. Doesn't lie. He said he'd received the folder contents gradually over 5 years from anonymous sources, former employees, and one close friend who couldn't take the guilt anymore. He testified that he verified each item before handing it to Cassie's legal team, telling them he'd testify if needed. And now here I am, he added, not because I'm a hero, but because I'm tired of this industry chewing people up and calling it art. He locked eyes with Diddy. You don't scare me, you never did. The courtroom was silent. The jury hung on every word the moment he sat down. The tone of the trial changed permanently. This wasn't just testimony, it was a reckoning, and Kid Rock had fired the first real shot. The courtroom sat silent as prosecutors turned to a witness log that Kid Rock's testimony had just unlocked. Witness number 9 was a woman named Cynthia M., a former personal chef hired for Diddy's weekend mansion retreats in Los Angeles from 2016 to 2019. She wasn't there to speculate. She came armed with receipts, payment logs, kitchen delivery orders, and schedules that lined up with the same nights Cassie had alleged she was isolated, restrained, or prepared for private entertainment events. When asked by the prosecutor to describe the atmosphere in the household, Cynthia spoke slowly and with discomfort. There were rules real strict. Ones, you couldn't look Cassie in the eye unless she looked at you first. You couldn't speak unless Mr. Combs gave you permission. One time, I asked if she wanted avocado on her salad. He heard me and made someone else finish the day's prep. I never talked to her again. She described a bizarre system of code colors used by staff to refer to Cassie's emotional state. Green meant she was calm, and reddy yellow meant she was crying, or unstable. Red meant cancel the party. But red didn't happen often. Someone always fixed her before it got to red. Her testimony sent shivers through the courtroom. Jurors began taking feverish notes. The prosecution showed digital logs submitted by Cynthia of kitchen deliveries arriving during private gatherings, and Cassie's name was blacked out on every record with the word VIP used instead. Cynthia testified she once saw Cassie enter the kitchen at 1 a.m. in tears, clutching a bathrobe, and asking quietly if she could use the landline phone. She whispered, "I can't find my phone. I think he took it." Again, the chef refused, fearing consequences, and was replaced 2 weeks later. But she never forgot the look on Cassie's face. I left because it started to feel less like a job and more like being part of something I didn't want to see. After Cynthia left the stand, prosecutors introduced Exhibit 78, be a list of surveillance footage, timestamps, and access logs from 3 of Diddy's properties. This information had originally been submitted through an anonymous source, but was authenticated through chain of custody documents traced back to a retired security consultant who once worked directly for Bad Boy Entertainment. One of the entries read, January 5th, 2018, Freak Room, 2 feet adjusted at 8:42 p.m. Visitor ID matched to Cassie Ventura. No exit log recorded until 2 a.m. The jury leaned in closer. The term Freak Room had only been rumored in blogs, message boards, and cryptic former artist interviews. But here it was on paper, verified. The prosecution explained that Freak Room referred to multiple guest bedrooms at Diddy's Miami and Los Angeles mansions, tricked out with low-lit ceiling lights, floor-length mirrors, hidden cameras, and two-way glass. Allegedly, the recordings from these rooms were encrypted, stored in external vaults, and cataloged under pseudonyms to prevent any direct tie to their contents. And it was Kid Rock who had helped uncover them. He provided a USB drive turned over prosecutors 2 weeks prior, containing partial directory files with folder names like Baker House Session, Studio 19 Visits, and VIP1 Raw. Some files were corrupted, others were encrypted, but audio technicians testified they were able to retrieve key metadata that proved when and where the files had been created. In one of the decrypted audio files played behind closed doors, a male voice, described by the technician as audibly consistent with Diddy's known recordings, is heard saying, "She's not leaving at the phone," and "shut the mirror." The room in question matched the January 5th footage log. Diddy's lawyers objected, calling the evidence non-conclusive, but the judge let it stand, saying the patterns were highly material. That was enough. Kid Rock sat quietly as the jury was shown a timeline on screen linking events in Cassie's lawsuit with recordings, guest logs, and footage timestamps from the drive. This wasn't just testimony anymore. This was architecture, and it was collapsing on Diddy the mood changed entirely. When the next witness stepped up, a former recording engineer from Bad Boy's main studio in New York, he asked to be identified only as Dave, and when questioned, he wasted no time getting to the point. There was a culture of shutting up if you saw something you didn't see it. If you heard something you didn't unless you want to be let go that week, Dave said. He remembered a night in early 2019 where Cassie arrived at the studio visibly shaken. He said she wasn't on the schedule yet was escorted into a side room, labeled Green Room, to the same nickname given in internal memos to one of the surveillance-heavy rooms at the studio. An assistant asked Diddy if she should be sent home. Diddy's answer, "She'll leave when I say she's done." Dave recorded that statement on his phone, and when asked by the prosecution if he still had the file, he nodded. "I emailed it to myself from my personal account. Didn't trust the cloud." The courtroom sat silent as the prosecution played a cleaned-up version of the audio. The voice was unmistakably Diddy, the tone sharp, controlling and cold. That was the moment juror number 4 visibly winced and closed their eyes. The prosecution then made their boldest move, yet they called Kid Rock back to the stand, this time as a character witness, not just to support Cassie, but to explain why he came forward. Rock said simply, "I had nothing to gain, everything to lose, but when a system like this stays hidden for this long, the only way to break it is to name it. This isn't about canceling a man, it's about freeing people from the chokehold of a culture that said, you better keep your mouth shut or your career's over." He stared across the room, not at Diddy, but at the lawyers, the gallery, the jury. "I don't care what it cost me, because what I saw, it still keeps me up." And then he stepped down. No defense rebuttal could erase that image. Kid Rock walking away unshaken. And Diddy looked like a man whose empire had been built on ice and was now starting to crack beneath his feet. By the 7th segment of the day, the court was no longer reacting with gasps or outrage. They were sitting in stunned silence, absorbing the scope of what had just been laid out. Prosecutors weren't just aiming at Diddy's personal behavior. They were going after the entire infrastructure that enabled it. It was a web, and Kid Rock had just handed them the blueprint. The prosecution next introduced documents from a defunct company called Shadow Track Entertainment, a shell production house connected to Diddy via Bad Boy subsidiaries. The company had no website, no public record of releases, and no social media presence, but had one purpose: paying off the people who worked at Diddy's private events. The ledgers listed event planners, caterers, and safety escorts, all of whom signed DAs and confidentiality agreements through Shadow Track. Some of the contracts even included oddly specific clauses like attendee silence shall be maintained under penalty of forfeit, and physical presence within estate spaces shall be considered consent to audio and video capture. Kid Rock, called back for clarification, testified that he had first come across Shadow Track when reviewing tax records sent to him anonymously by a former accountant who claimed to have been fired after asking too many questions. "I didn't even know what I was looking at first," he said, holding up a copy of a tax statement. "But the deeper I went, the more I realized there were dozens of people being paid to watch, but never speak." He detailed how one receipt caught his attention: a $12,000 payment labeled equipment sanitation, and a separate $9,000 listing for session supervision 2 nights. These entries matched up with dates on Cassie's original testimony nights. She described being prepared for Diddy's more private events. The jury began to shift uncomfortably to drive it home. The prosecution introduced one final piece, an internal HR memo from Bad Boy Enterprises obtained via subpoena, stating that employees were encouraged to avoid personal relationships with VIP guests, especially during Red Zone weekends. A document defined Red Zone weekends as periods of increased privacy and executive discretion. It wasn't just Diddy anymore. It was a corporate machinery built to protect him. And Kid Rock, with nothing but a folder and a microphone, had just cracked it wide open. By the afternoon recess, the tone of the courtroom had shifted. Diddy's defense team looked like a crew watching a sinking ship. Their arguments were becoming weaker, more procedural objections were being overruled. The jury was locked, and then came the witness that nobody expected. Her name was Sonia Lane, a former executive producer for an MTV special that featured Diddy back in 2015. She remained silent for nearly a decade, but inspired by Kid Rock's testimony, she had contacted the prosecution. That morning, the judge allowed her to take the stand. She described a shoot at one of Diddy's New York penis, where Cassie was scheduled to make a brief cameo. Sonia testified that Cassie arrived looking unwell, tired, and almost vacant. But what stood out was that Diddy ordered multiple crew members to leave the set. He said he didn't want anyone messing with the vibe. Then he shut the doors, and they stayed closed for almost 45 minutes. When asked what happened when the doors reopened, Sonia looked directly at the jury and said, "Cassie came out crying. He came out smiling. That single line made one juror drop their pen, another visibly clench their fist. Kid Rock, still seated in the gallery, didn't move, but his impact was written across the courtroom. Diddy's attorney tried to call for a recess to review the last-minute edition of Sonia Lane's testimony, but the judge wasn't having it. This court has been more than patient. We proceed. Diddy's face by then had lost all trace of swagger. His lips were drawn thin. His stare had gone vacant. The man who once strutted through red carpets and Super Bowl stages now looked like someone who didn't recognize his own future. Before court adjourned, the judge allowed Kid Rock to deliver a closing comment, a rare gesture, but one permitted given his formal cooperation and prior testimony. He stood slowly, adjusted his suit, and walked to the center of the gallery. When I first came here, I figured I'd be dismissed as a loudmouth rocker with a grudge, and maybe I am, but what I saw, what I know, I couldn't let it rot in my head anymore. He paused. A lot of people will ask why I'm even involved. What business is it of mine? The answer is simple. It's everybody's business. When the powerful prey on the powerless, he gestured toward Cassie. That woman sat in silence for years because she thought no one would believe her, because a man she was up against had the world in his pocket. He took a deep breath. Well, I'm here to say we believe you. I believe you. And from what I saw in this courtroom today, a hell of a lot of other people do too. As he sat down in the courtroom, didn't clap, they didn't cheer, but every eye turned to Diddy. And for the first time, he didn't look defiant. He looked afraid. The court recessed for the day. Outside, headlines screamed. Inside, history had just been made. The next morning, the sun hadn't even fully risen when headlines erupted like firecrackers. Kid Rock exposes Diddy. Hollywood shaken. But this wasn't just tabloid frenzy. Something had shifted in a matter of hours. The shock waves from the trial testimony reached Capitol Hill. Congress members began calling for a review of entertainment industry and power structures. Senator Lisa Donnelly, speaking on MSNBC, said, "This isn't just about one artist or one victim. This is about a culture that has operated in the shadows for too long." By noon, at least 4 A-list artists released statements distancing themselves from Diddy. One longtime collaborator issued a carefully worded Instagram post in light of recent testimony. "I've decided to suspend all professional ties and reevaluate past partnerships." Then came the financial blow. A major streaming platform issued a quiet but devastating update. All Diddy-produced projects were being temporarily removed pending internal review. Another brand that once featured him in a national campaign pulled every trace of the content and suspended their deal indefinitely. But the most sobering moment came in a quiet corner of the internet. A video surfaced. A fan recorded interview from years earlier, barely noticed at the time, in it Cassie was asked what advice she'd give to young women trying to break into the music industry. Her response was soft-haunted and suddenly terrifying in hindsight. "Trust your gut. Don't let the glitz blind you. Not every opportunity is safe." Now the world was finally listening as Diddy left the courthouse that evening, surrounded by silent security and an army of flashbulbs. He didn't speak. He didn't wave. He didn't look up. The empire he had built wasn't collapsing. It was being dismantled piece by piece, by truth, by testimony, and by the one man who chose to speak when silence was safest. Kid Rock.